This is the Spirit and Wellness Show. News and information from a higher perspective. With your host, Harry Wilkinson. Well, hello there. My name is Harry Wilkinson, and I am the host here of the Spirit and Wellness Show. This is the show where we take a look at the days and weeks events, happenings in the world of politics, international news, the environment, technology, everything we hear about through the course of a week. Maybe through our new media like our smartphones and tablets and social media, or the more traditional outlets, 24-hour news, even newspapers, or the good old radio in the car as you're driving to work or back home. We have access to more information than we have ever had, and more immediate information than we have ever had, and possibly more than we need, but that is probably a debatable topic and not something I'm going to get into today. I do know that there are many people who feel overwhelmed by the sheer amount of information that seems to be bouncing off around them. And that's understandable. It's easy to get overwhelmed. I understand that there have been some studies that show that there are physical and health effects to being constantly bombarded with the kind of in particular news stories that are chosen or are broadcast to us, particularly those that emphasize what might be considered negative information, or just information that's startling and perhaps a bit disturbing on first listen. This is what a lot of news centers around. This is what a lot of people feel is a lot of the what we call gatekeepers. Those are the editors and directors and so forth who choose the stories that get printed or broadcast or told. Increasingly, of course, with the internet and our new media and the new ways that we have of finding information, increasingly those gatekeepers' role in disseminating information is narrowing to a great degree as we take on more responsibility for finding our own information, which I think ultimately is a good thing. But let me not digress here. This show is about taking a step back from all of that and looking at these stories from a higher perspective, from the perspective of what I like to call divine mind, the connection that we all share, the place where we all truly reside, the truest parts of ourselves. And we take a look at how these stories are creations of our own, and how we interact with these stories, what they're telling us about ourselves, what we're telling us about ourselves, and how we can empower ourselves by going within these situations and recognizing the truth about them, recognizing that they are illusions, they are stories we're telling, and these are not the truth of who and what we are, but a rather engaging, in some cases confounding, but in almost all situations certainly encompassing game, virtual reality game, if you will. And when we recognize how brilliant the setup is of what we've created, and then we can take energy back from it and understand it for what it is, then it begins to have less power over us, and we begin to empower ourselves. So these things can be opportunities if used wisely. And that's what I try to do on this show, focus us in a direction, or focus myself, really, because I do this show really to remind myself of these things. And along the way, if I help others, well, then that is more to the good. Now, on this week's show, we're going to be looking at some new information that we have about the connection between air pollution and behavior, interestingly enough. I mean, we certainly have heard enough about the connection between air pollution and, health problems and that, and our physical health, but the idea that air pollution can affect your behavior is interesting. So we'll take a look at that. So we'll take a look at another study on how gratitude can help you sleep. And then, of course, we'll do, as I've begun doing since the beginning of the year, our regular meditation, guided meditation. And I apologize for missing that last week. Unfortunately, we went long as we got into this discussion about thoughts and prayers. You might remember, if you were listening last week, about the efficacy of thoughts and prayers, which has become much maligned in the media these days, understandably so. But I just wanted to remind folks what thoughts and prayers really are. They're not excuses for non-behavior. They are calls to action, if anything. And they do have an effect. Well, I mean, we talked about the idea of having thoughts and prayers focused on those who have been stubborn about making what appears to be necessary changes in laws regarding gun ownership and gun sales. And don't you know, this week the answers began to come, not from the political arenas so much, although there's been some movement in that direction, in which we've had our president, who was an NRA supporter and supported by the NRA, take a stand that the NRA does not, several stands that the NRA does not approve of. And so we've seen some movement in that direction. But more dramatic movement, I would say, is among the corporate sector. We've had several corporations, including Dick's Sporting Goods, which is a huge sporting store chain, come out very publicly against selling assault weapons and promising that they will no longer be selling them in response to the tragedy that took place, the tragic shooting that took place in Parkland in Florida. And, I'm all for it. In some ways, it's kind of, what took you so long, but better late than never, But good, we're there. So this means, to me, this may be a kind of tipping point, kind of in the way not too long ago where we reached this tipping point on Confederate flags, and very quickly flags were being taken down, flags were not going to be sold anymore in stores, as I guess the zeitgeist of the times, or this country in particular, finally awoke to the symbolism that flag represents, and what it might encourage in some folks, and how it makes other folks feel. It's something that for African Americans they've had to deal with, particularly in the South, for 50 years or so, since the Civil Rights Movement. That's when Confederate flags became popular again. Not really, although there are those that dispute this and say that these are historic, remembrances. Not so much. It's not a remembrance of the Civil War as it is a sort of a digging in of heels, or making a statement about the civil rights of African Americans, because that's when those flags began to really flourish. But again, we reached that tipping point where there was an incident, and again, unfortunately, people's lives had to be lost for that. But very quickly, those flags began to be removed and not allowed in public places, particularly state or federal government buildings. And the same sort of tipping point, I think, has been reached with the concept of gay marriage, which very quickly became embraced after decades of backlash against it. And even the benefits of marijuana, and making marijuana legal, at the very least for medicinal purposes. These are things that had historically been deemed almost impossible to change, and then very quickly began to change. So, as I've said before, and at the risk of repeating myself, it's not about political solutions. It's not about military solutions. And it's not even about monetary solutions. It's about spiritual solutions, in the sense of an awakening, an awareness, and a willingness, a change in consciousness, if you will. And that occurs, within. And once you reach that point, then everything else falls into place. And the other things, the politics, the money, the protest, all of that stuff can be used as tools. But it all begins, within. That's my point. So, enough said about that. Now, we'll talk about those studies that are kind of really have some really interesting new information about gratitude and air pollution. And our main topic today, we are continuing with our look at aloneness, and the power of being alone, and how to the benefits of being alone. Quite often being alone is given very negative connotations. We sometimes associate it with loneliness, sometimes with loners, who are supposed to be strange, weird people, maybe doing weird things, often suspects of, doing, horrible things. But being alone is a very positive thing, and can be a very positive thing. So we've been talking about, studies that look at that, and how we might change the view of people who are alone, because there are people, lots of people who are alone. We like to believe